This regular meeting of the Montana Public Service Commission is now in session. The time is 9:30 a.m. The date is September the 10th, 2019. We are in the Bollinger Room of the offices of the Montana Public Service Commission in Helena, Montana. In the Bollinger Room with us today, Commissioners Koopman, Pinocci, and O'Donnell, and on the phone, Vice Chairman Lake. Before we move to, before we move to public comment, I want to ask Mr. Rosequist to come up and assist me in some presentations here. We've talked from time to time about how very fortunate this commission is to have the quality and caliber of staff that we do, and it's certainly true. And part of what makes them so unique to us and so very effective is the longevity that we have on the part of so many staff members. So we're going to recognize three today that have realized milestones with regard to length of service. And Robin, will begin with you, have you come up, and Will, come on over here where I can get these to you. And accept your 5-year pin. You're spending a lot of time up here being recognized these days. Congratulations. And Dagan, come up here, please. Dagan's been with us for 10 years, doing yeoman's work. Congratulations. And Gary, 15 years. You're a testament to stamina or something. Thank you all very much to show our appreciation to all of those. Are there other commissioners who wish to offer congratulations to our tenured employees? Commissioner O'Donnell.
Mr. Chairman, does this mean that they all have the same anniversary date, just 5 years apart? I mean, that's pretty remarkable that they coordinated. Now, I did want to say that I have stated publicly to the legislature and anybody else that I am very, very proud of the work that the staff does here, and that I'm very, very fortunate that having a really good, cohesive staff to have my back and provide all of us with the information that we need on a timely basis, on a comprehensive basis. I've never had any time where I felt that the staff let us down by doing inadequate research on any issue, whatever. So thank you very much to all.
Commissioner Koopman.
Yeah, I would just ditto what Commissioner O'Donnell has said and Chairman Johnson. I wonder with Dagan doing yeoman's work, why isn't he doing his own work? Bad joke.
It's because we let Yeoman go last year.
Yeah, Yeoman, yeah, he kind of gets away with murder. But seriously, though, we have a small staff here. It's under 35. Virtually, just about every other state in the union has their public utility or public service commissions have far more employees, and I just find it amazing the amount of quality professional work that the staff puts out. Every one of you. And how much, how seriously you take your work, how much you love your work, and realize the importance of the PSC and its mission. We wouldn't be much, we wouldn't be anything without you. And I just, from day one when I came here, I was not only impressed but somewhat humbled by the institutional knowledge and the dedication, the willingness to work extra hours, the accommodating attitude with 5 bosses. I can't imagine having 5 bosses. Plus, of course, your own supervisors, and it's just it's a very challenging role you play and a very, very important one. And the fact that that these folks stick around as long as they do, 5 years, 10 years, 15. In the private sector, or even with other areas of government, that's unusual these days. People move around a lot, I know, and so we all really appreciate your devotion to your work. And long after we're gone off the commission, why these staff people are still going to be doing their work and doing it extremely well. And I just thank you for that.
Other commissioners? All right, we will proceed then to the regular agenda, beginning, with public comment. Is there anyone who wishes to make public comment before the commission at this time? Seeing none, then we will proceed to the regular agenda and action items. Item number 1, approval of the minutes from the previous meeting.
So moved.
Been moved and seconded. We approve those minutes. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Work session items. Item number 1 in docket D, 2019.03.018, Cut Bank Gas Company. Mr. Casey.
Good morning, Commissioners. So the work session today is to consider the application of Cut Bank Gas for true-up of its annual gas costs and reconciliation of its Universal System Benefits Program. With regard to the application itself, in total, approval of the application would result in a net decrease in rates of about 4 cents per MCF. As with the Miller Oil docket or work session last week, we are recommending that the commission approve the application on an interim basis rather than a final basis. And the reason for that is of course Senate Bill 244 and figuring out how the commission's going to implement that bill. For now, I'll leave it at that, and if you guys have questions, we're available.
Okay. I would move we approve staff recommendation in this docket. Is there a second?
Second.
Been moved and seconded that we approve staff recommendation. Is there discussion of the motion? Hearing none, call the question. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you both very much. Robin, try and be a little less talkative next time, would you please? Okay, moving on now to work session item number 2. Commission initiated with the PCS MCC tax rate. I would point out that this is really a formulaic procedure that we have to exercise, we have to go through every year, simply acknowledging that we have, in fact, looked at the same numbers that DOR's looked at, done the same arithmetic, and came up with the same answer. Ms. Hinman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. The purpose of this work session is to request approval of the new tax collection rate relating to funding both the Public Service Commission and the Montana Consumer Council. Each year, the Department of Revenue calculates the rate at which fees are collected from regulated utilities to fund the Public Service Commission and Consumer Council operations. The rates are based on a formula which consider 3 main factors. 1, the anticipated gross operating revenues of regulated utilities for the upcoming fiscal year, which are presumed to be equal with the amounts for the previous fiscal year, in this case, which ended June 30th, 2019. 2, the agency's unspent funds as of June 30th, 2019. And 3, the agency's anticipated cash requirements or appropriation for the next 15 months. This work session is held each year after the rate is recalculated and is basically a formality for approving the new rates. We need commission approval on the new rates because we do issue orders basically discontinuing the old rate and allowing companies to recover fees in their rates and charges at the new rate. Each new rate goes into effect on October 1st and runs through September 30th. The new PSC rate beginning October 1st, 2019 through September 30th, 2020 will be 0.439 of 1%, up from 0.162 of 1%, and the MCC rate beginning October 1st, 2019 through September 30th of 2020 will be 0.127 of 1%, up from 0.051 of 1%. Staff recommends approving the new rates as calculated by the Department of Revenue for the purpose of funding the PSC and MCC operations to take effect October 1st, 2019. Mr. Chairman.
Is there a motion to approve our revenue stream for the next fiscal year and the following? Commissioner O'Donnell?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move to accept the rates as proffered.
Is there a second? Been moved and seconded. We approve the rates for the next 2 years. Or next year. Is there discussion of the motion? Commissioner O'Donnell.
You mentioned the three considerations. So one is how much money is left over at the end of the fiscal year. And I have two things come to mind on that. One is that it's imprudent to spend everything down to zero at the end of the year, so I'm not sure how that's taken into account. Also, as there are many organizations, government organizations, which, from what I see, take advantage of that by spending every last dime they have so that it won't affect their budget the next year. How is that taken into consideration in this case, in our case?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner O'Donnell, we're actually talking about cash on hand. We're not actually talking about appropriation. We can only spend within the appropriation given to us by the legislature, but we're actually talking about cash on hand, which we can't spend without that appropriation. So whatever cash balance we have just rolls over into the next calculation, offsetting the new calculation.
Okay, thank you.
Further discussion of the motion? Hearing none, call the question on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you.
Work session item number 3, docket 2019.02.008 and 2019.02.009, Grizzly Wind and Black Bear LLC. Mr. Casey.
Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. So before you today is Grizzly Black Bear's motion for reconsideration in this docket. In summary, the motion calls into question the Commission's decision with regard to its base avoided energy cost, avoided capacity valuation, and ancillary deductions for contingency reserves, regulation, and Inc. The premise of Grizzly Black Bear's argument is essentially that in reaching an avoided cost calculation, that the Commission has to take an avoided energy cost estimate sort of package provided as a whole by a party and accept that entire package rather than sort of look at the individual pieces of evidence with regard to the individual components of that estimate and reach a determination as to where the most accurate figures come from in the body of evidence as a whole presented during the proceeding. So in this case, or with regard to the motion in particular, we've got an avoided cost estimate that was provided in May of 2018, and another one that was provided in, I believe, May of 2019, and portions of those different components, different of those components were drawn from either the May 2018 or the May 2019 package, and Grizzly Black Bear is essentially saying, no, you've got to pick one or you've got to pick the other, that somehow PURPA demands some sort of consistency in that regard. Staff's take on that is that PURPA does not, and that adopting sort of a consistency for consistency's sake approach is in fact probably in conflict with what PURPA requires. You as a commission are required to determine an avoided cost, and so I think implicit with that is a requirement that you determine an accurate avoided cost. You know, the avoided cost is not a range of prices within which that number falls. It's the number that the utility would pay for energy and capacity, but for the QF. And so adopting an approach that says that you've got to assume this whole package rather than make an assessment following a hearing and presentation of evidence as to what pieces of evidence are the most accurate or reflect avoided cost most accurately ignores that requirement. So I think that what in the absence of a valid argument in that regard, what the commission is left with is determining, you know, whether or not, with regard to those specific components, there is credible evidence that was presented at hearing to support those different avoided cost components. With regard to the ancillary service deductions, contingency reserves, regulation, and Inc., staff believes that there are. With regard to contingency reserves and regulation, those were numbers that were presented by both parties. Essentially, both parties presented the same figures, and implied that, hey, we're in agreement on this figure. We think this is the appropriate amount. And I think that, you know, assuming that the commission viewed that testimony to be credible, I think that it's entirely appropriate that the commission accept that testimony. With regard to Inc., you were in sort of the opposite position at the time of hearing, in that staff recommended that the positions that were presented, or the arguments that were presented by Grizzly Black Bear and by Northwestern, were essentially unreasonable, that they couldn't realistically be adopted. And so the commission was left with essentially one piece of evidence or one argument that staff did view as reasonable, and that was that of the MCC. And let's see, the part of Grizzly Black Bear's objection to our determination with regard to Inc. is that it ties into, or it as its source, the MCC used figures that appear in the 2019 draft resource plan, and in our order, we express reluctance in relying too heavily on that plan. And I think it's important to clarify that I think the reluctance that staff expressed in its memo, and that I think carries over into the order, is not necessarily a hesitancy with regard to the accuracy of specific portions of information that appear in that plan. I think that pieces of information that were in the draft plan are valuable for our determination in this proceeding, or can be valuable at least. And then that reluctance, that reluctance can be, I think, better expressed as, hey, we don't want reliance on certain pieces of information to sort of implicitly constitute approval of that final draft plan before we've had the chance to review it. So I think that the reluctance can be better expressed as a procedural rather than a substantive concern. So with that, that brings me to the one component that I think does merit reconsideration, and that's our avoided capacity valuation. Essentially, in our order, the only reason we express for adopting the 2018 avoided capacity valuation as opposed to the one that appears in the draft plan is that, hey, we're concerned about relying on this plan too heavily. And so I do have some concern that as it's expressed in the order, we really haven't articulated credible evidence as to why we adopted the 2018 plan or the 2018 figure rather than the 2019 figure. And I think the fact that figure was agreed upon by both Northwestern and the MCC, the 2019 figure rather than the 2018 figure, constitutes a reasonable basis to accept that number and essentially open up the order in this matter for reconsideration, and actually do reconsider our avoided capacity valuation and adopt what Grizzly and Black Bear have requested in that regard. So I guess in summary, staff's recommendation is that you open the matter up for reconsideration, and then on reconsideration, that you deny the request for relief that Grizzly and Black Bear have made with regard to ancillary service deductions and, to the extent necessary, the base avoided energy cost, and then award Grizzly Black Bear their requested relief with regard to avoided capacity. And if you have any questions, I will do my best to answer them.
Is there a motion, Commissioner Koopman, to open this docket for reconsideration?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I move that we reconsider these dockets.
Is there a second? Second. Been moved and seconded. We open the docket for reconsideration. Discussion of that motion, Commissioner Koopman?
Well, and once we've passed that motion, then we can go on to the specifics. Is that the way we're going to handle this? Okay.
Yes.
Well, this obviously allows us to have that discussion and then for the commission to take action if we so choose. So I support my motion.
There's no further discussion. We'll call the question. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Now, Mr. Casey, do you want two separate motions here, one on the denial part and one on the grant part, or how would you like to proceed here?
I think that I think it can probably be safely offered as one motion unless the movement, I think, sees some utility in offering it as two.
You want to take a shot at crafting that, Commissioner Koopman?
What if the movement doesn't agree? Yeah, let's go ahead to put this on the table for discussion. I'll move that we approve both of the staff recommendations in this matter. The denial of Grizzly Black Bear's request for, as it pertains to ancillary service charges, and granting their relief as it pertains to avoided capacity valuation calculations that we've done.
Is there a second? I'll second. Been moved and seconded. We adopt those recommendations. Commissioner Koopman?
Yeah, I guess to begin with, I tend to agree that our goal is to get the most accurate numbers we can. And if some of those are gleaned from a previous year, from 2018 rather than 2019, I'm talking now about the avoided cost valuation. That's for the commission to determine where the most accurate numbers are. But do either of you see any problem here with sort of mixing and matching between 2 years? I mean, it's like we picked and chose. I read their arguments. I don't find them particularly persuasive, but I wonder if we can go too far in just sort of creating a mixed calculation.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Koopman, they're two different animals: avoided energy costs, ancillary services. I have no problem with it. With mixing and matching.
Yeah. That's more or less the way I see it too, and I don't think their argument was persuasive, but so I am inclined in this matter to go ahead and now. Do you feel that there's any need also for any additional verbiage, any additional language in the order to explain this a little bit more? Or for that matter, can we get by without granting the avoided cost motion, but put different language in the order to support that position?
So let me see if Chairman, Commissioner Koopman, let me see if I understand you correctly. Are you asking whether staff believes that we can safely deny the motion as a whole?
Yeah, both motions. The point is made that we were concerned about the, if you will, there were procedural concerns, and that maybe we didn't address them as well as we could have initially in the order. And I'm wondering if just cleaning that up might be enough.
So in response to that, I think, yes, I think it's possible that the commission could deny the requested relief as a whole on reconsideration. I think that in order to do that, I think that the way that the order is drafted right now, my concern with it is that it doesn't articulate a real sound basis for adopting, or maybe a sound basis isn't the correct way to put it, but a basis that is based in factual evidence gathered during the proceeding. That doesn't mean that that evidence doesn't exist. I think that it's possible that that 2018 value for avoided capacity, that there is credible evidence to support that. I just think we haven't articulated it. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what that is, what that credible evidence would be. And so I guess to your question, yes, I think we can deny the avoider. You could safely deny the avoided capacity request as long as you can articulate a sound basis for sticking with the 2018 value. And I think that clearing up what we discussed regarding the 2019 draft plan does a little bit of that, but I think that we've got to go a step further and actually state why we believe the 2018 valuation to be more accurate than the 2019 valuation. Does that answer your question?
It does, and it seems to me that would be a reasonable alternate position we could take, deny both, but explain better why we chose 2018. Naturally, the inclination is to say, well, 2019 is newer information; it's going to be more accurate, and we've come to a different conclusion than that, but we haven't explained it very well. If we go with the 2019, then the avoided cost is somewhat higher. And how much higher is it?
For the capacity,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Koopman, 257 versus 190 ATC, or 1076 versus, I believe, 749, although my calculations may a little closer to 8 if you're just looking at the peak load.
So there is some impact here on ratepayers, of course, as well as obviously on the applicants. Well, but at this point, I'll stand by my motion, deny one, grant the other, but I'd be interested in any other input from commissioners, because we can divide this into two, or we can amend my motion if it's the will of the commission to do so, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other discussion from commissioners? Commissioner O'Donnell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm just curious. It seems to me what you're saying is even though all three parties agreed on a particular valuation, that would seem to me that would stand on its own, and that any explanation on our part justifying their agreement would be nice, but it's superfluous. I would think is that if they agree and we agree with that, we don't have any objection to that. I think that would be sufficient, except for the fact that the only benefit that I could see is in future proceedings that other parties would have some commentary to rely upon for precedence. But that would seem to me to be a nice thing, but not really important, and that we would be in really comfortable position just denying both parts and just leaving it the way it is. I don't see why there's a real substantive issue here. Is that correct?
So, Chairman, Commissioner O'Donnell, you perhaps already know this, and maybe I don't need to articulate this, but with regard to the avoided capacity valuation, there was a number provided in 2018 that it was provided by Northwestern, and it was found in Grizzly and Black Bear's petitions. So we've got a 2018 number that was agreed on by both parties. Later in the proceeding, there was a 2019 number that was also agreed on by both parties, and that's the number that Grizzly and Black Bear are advocating for now. So it's a second avoided capacity calculation that is also it also finds support from both Northwestern and Grizzly Black Bear, and I think that Grizzly Black Bear's argument can be understood as I think the MCC, I think, in their testimony expressed that, hey, you should adopt the most recent figure in this regard, and I believe that our order as it presently stands, I could be wrong, but it states, we see that position as reasonable. We think that the more current information should be the information that we rely upon, and so I think that if we're going to go back to the initially or originally agreed upon avoided capacity calculation, yes, I think it's good that it found support from both parties, and I think that's a basis upon which we can sort of hang our hat. But I also think that it would be valuable to explain, parties adopted position A, but then sort of implicitly abandoned that position in favor of position B, and both came in and agreed on position B. And so why are we going to rely on that initially agreed upon position that they implicitly sort of stepped away from in favor of this newer, more current position? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so I get that, but is that the evidence as the hearing went on, they changed their positions and agreed on something. I should think that would be. I mean, it seems to me that would be sufficient in and of itself, that it's in the record. That why do we need to explain that in the order? I just don't understand why we need to do that instead of just say, they agreed on this, move on from there. It's not a substantial issue. I just don't know why we're going to this additional thing unless it has some bearing on future proceedings. That's my point.
Is there further discussion from commissioners?
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Vice Chairman Lake.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The way I see this is that, okay, they did have an agreement at one time at the lower number, and during the proceeding, they both came back and both agreed to the higher number, and that's the most recent one, and I do not see how we could possibly use anything other than that and have it correct in the mind of regulating. I mean, we can't just go back and pick up numbers from the past simply because we like them better. If you have an agreed-upon number that's more recent and work off of that. Am I missing something on that, Luke?
Chairman, Commissioner Lake, no, I don't think you are. I think that fairly well sums up what staff's position is with regard to the avoided capacity valuation.
If I may say something for staff, Mr. Chairman. In paragraph 49 of the order, it states essentially that the Commission found shortcomings with most, if not all, of the avoided cost proposals made in the later stages of the case. And after removing these from consideration, the Commission is left with the avoided cost provided by Northwestern on May 31st, 2018. So that is substantially the reason the Commission adopted the 2018 avoided energy cost. But that doesn't hold for the capacity cost. It's a little different, and besides, MCC supports the later capacity proposal.
And that's the point I was getting at, Mr. Chairman. I think that we're basically committed to using the information that's been provided that had the most recent numbers, especially since it's been agreed to by all parties.
Commissioner Koopman, let me make a brief comment, then you may close, if that's all right. Let me say, A, that I think the main motion gets us to where we need to be, especially if, Commissioner Koopman, it is deemed to include the language in the last paragraph in the staff memo under recommendation in brief, which says staff also recommends taking the opportunity to clarify certain portions of the commission's reasoning contained in the order, et cetera. I think that is the key operative language here and honestly, I'm kind of ambivalent whether we grant or deny the second part of the motion, but I think with that clear direction to clarify, we're probably good with the motion as it stands. Commissioner Koopman.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that should be included. And I guess just one other question. Are we essentially saying here that we made a mistake on the capacity cost?
Chairman Johnson, Commissioner Koopman, I think it can be interpreted that way. That, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, I think that is the very point of a motion for reconsideration, is that a party, in order to pursue judicial remedies, needs to exhaust their administrative remedies, and they need to give the commission every opportunity to say, you know what, yes, we perhaps made a mistake here. We think this is a more accurate position, and so we're going to take this opportunity to do that. I think that, I mean, in black and white terms, yes, I think it can be viewed as saying, hey, yeah, we made a mistake here, and we should step back away from it and take this position.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Koopman, I'm not sure I'd go quite that far. I think both of those estimates are within the zone of reasonableness, and the first one was agreed on by 2 of the parties. The second one was agreed on by 3 of the parties. It's not a huge, impact on ratepayers, and so I think they're both legitimate numbers. But in this case, where MCC also supports the third estimate, or the higher estimate, and it was later, and we've kind of he's gone through the procedural arguments regarding the plan. It's in our opinion, maybe a safer bet, but neither of them are in error.
Okay, and thank you both for that. And for the record, I don't have any problem with admitting when we make a mistake either. We're human, and that's why we have this process, and why there's the opportunity to correct or at least to refine. And I don't know if in this case it was a mistake or just simply 2 reasonable positions, but one more convincing or more reasonable than the other. So I guess that doesn't matter. But I appreciate you both being very direct about that, and based on that, I'm in support of. I remain in support of the motion. I think the fact that MCC, as the advocate for the ratepayer, supporting the 2019 capacity evaluation, I think that does it for me. That makes me comfortable with granting that part of their reconsideration, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. With no further discussion of the motion, then we'll call the question. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Moving on now to the final work session for the day, which is docket 2019.06.020. T-19.20.ST, Mergenthaler transfer. Mr. Kraske.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. On May 2nd, 2019, the Commission received a short-term lease application from Mergenthaler Transfer and Storage to lease the authority to Mesa Moving and Storage. We noticed it on the agenda, and then on May 10th, by staff action, the Commission staff issued a notice of staff action approving the lease for PSE Authority number 1464 from Mergenthaler to Mesa. That lease currently expires October 11th. On May 14th, Mesa issued a press release stating that it has acquired the moving business operations of Mergenthaler Transfer and Storage. And then on May 19th, an article appeared in the Helena Independent Record quoting the press release. During this time, representatives from both Mergenthaler and Mesa met with PSE staff various times. We explained the transfer process, the lease, and the sale and transfer process, and worked with them through that. On July 3rd, the Commission received the application for sale and transfer of the authority from Mergenthaler to Mesa. We noticed it on the Commission agenda. The protest deadline was July 30th, and no protests were received by the deadline. The Commission staff had some questions based on the application that was completed, so we sent data requests 1 through 7 to Mergenthaler and Mesa. We received those responses on August 21st. I've also attached those responses to the memo that I've circulated to commissioners last week. As the Commission is aware, the Commission has statutory authority to review leases and sale and transfers pursuant to 6912-325. Any right, privilege, or certificate held may only be sold, assigned, leased, transferred, or inherited as other property only by authorization of the Commission. As the Commission is aware of, it's very common for a motor carrier to file both an application for lease of an authority and then a sale and transfer to allow the Commission time to review the sale and transfer pending a decision by the Commission. Like I mentioned, representatives from Mergenthaler and Mesa have met with Commission staff multiple times. They've been very responsive to staff requests for information and have been diligent in keeping in contact with staff. Like I mentioned from my memo, staff was confused why the Mergenthaler to Mesa transition appeared to have been consummated on May 14th with the press release that was issued. We also have administrative rule involving sale and transfers I quoted in my memo about sale and transfers not being retroactive, and then I set out some of the various statutory provisions involving violations of Commission orders. Based on the staff memo that was issued, late yesterday, we received a letter from Mesa Systems that attempted to respond to the memo that was circulated. I've circulated that letter to commissioners. They indicate that they sincerely apologize, that the staff felt like they did not follow the rules and the requirements. They indicate that they were actively meeting with staff regarding the transaction prior to the sale, and they sought input throughout the process. They tried to address head-on the issue about the public notice of the sale, and that they indicate one of our concerns was that a PSE public notice announcement of the sale of the business that, for whatever reason, does not fully close could put all employees in jeopardy of leaving the company in fear that their employer is getting out of the business. The timing made this complicated, but we have always been open and forthcoming with PSE staff. They said they want to continue a positive relationship with the PSE and be responsive to any of staff's questions or requests, and that they want to be a business that runs on integrity, and they propose that they'd be willing to pay some type of fine. They'd like to move forward from this, and they didn't intend to violate any rules or statutes through the process. In the staff's memo that Susie, myself, and Zach put together, we recommend 2 different options for the Commission to consider. First, either approve the sale and transfer application from Mergenthaler to Mesa with strong wording in the final order, critical of the perceived closing of the sale, Or second, schedule an oral argument or public meeting for representatives from Mergenthaler and Mesa to appear before the commission to explain what occurred in the transaction and any misunderstandings. As I mentioned, that recommendation was prepared prior to us receiving the response from Mesa yesterday, where they attempted to respond to some of the concerns from the memo. I don't have a real strong opinion either way between those two options. I think based on Mesa Systems' response in the letter, and like I mentioned, they did attempt to work with Susie and myself as productively as possible, even though they did close the transaction prior to the filing of the sale and transfer with the commission. Under their circumstances that they indicate, my recommendation would be that the commission issue a final order approving the sale and transfer, that the final order should respond to the explanation by Mesa about why it closed the sale, and then in the strongest legal terms possible express the commission's concerns that the process was not followed as set out by statute and rule, that we could have initiated legal action consistent with that, and going forward, Mesa Systems is required to strictly comply with all motor carrier provisions in Montana. Otherwise, the commission could initiate an order to show cause proceeding if they violate any of our commission rules or statutes going forward. Susie, did you have anything else to add?
Chairman Johnson and Commissioners, good morning. I agree with everything that Justin stated. I will say that Mesa did communicate with both of us in regards to getting things handled productively and efficiently. However, things, the sale was completed before they actually applied for it with us for that sales and transfer. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. Researching Secretary of State office records, we find the principal offices of Mergenthaler are in fact in Helena, Montana. So I will make the motion that we adopt Mr. Kraske and the staff's recommendation with regard to approving the sale, and then writing that strong language into the order expressing our disappointment in the manner in which aspects of this sale and transfer have transpired. Is there a second to the motion? I'll second. Been moved and seconded. We adopt staff recommendation here. Discussion of the motion. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm a little bit confused right here. So Mesa has agreed to pay a $500 fine on that thing. It seems to me that if our procedure has to do with the approval of a transfer, our authority only rests with the existing certificate holder. So it would seem to me to be appropriate if a fine is levied, which it seems to me is a very significant thing to do, going forward, instead of just having strong language, but to say that it's there. And $500 is certainly a small amount of money that it should not be the Mesa, but it should be Mergenthaler. Is that?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner O'Donnell, throughout this process, we've had contact by both Mergenthaler and Mesa. I will say it generally seems like Mesa has kind of been the more active party trying to move things forward as the acquiring company. As the commission is aware, a lot of times these applications come in the form of a joint application that we've seen on the water utility side or the electricity side. Here, initially, they didn't have an attorney. We required them to get an attorney as they began the process, so I think they were trying to work through the process a little bit. But it is a fair question of who should be fined if the commission decides that they did want to put, require a fine. Mergenthaler, as the existing carrier that has operated in Montana for a long time as a regulated carrier, is generally in the best position of knowing the state of motor carrier authority in Montana and how the commission regulates it, and you would generally think would be more aware of the issues of this process. Specifically, I think the Commission's probably aware of, Mergenthaler protested a sale and transfer application year and a half ago up in the Kalispell area, and we had a hearing through that process. So they're generally very familiar with the reasons for that process, and I think that's, some of the frustration here too, is Mergenthaler is very aware of that process, and that's, I think, something for the Commission to consider, who should be fined. I mean, the Commission could also fine both Mergenthaler and Mesa if it decided to do. One of the hard things is for the size of the company involved, that amount is a very small part, but it is something the Commission could consider and was proposed in the Mesa letter.
Yes, thank you. And also point out that not only is Mergenthaler an existing operating entity in Montana, but Mesa is as well. So both of them are very, very familiar with all of these things. There was a year and a half ago, there was a telecommunications company that operated partially in my district that sold their operations to a company out of Wyoming, and we found out about it in the newspaper. And we didn't really, because the company that sold, I think they just simply went out of business. I think that strong language, if we just keep on issuing strong language, and anytime we depart from the strong language to institute a fine, that it would seem to be a really punitive type of thing. I think as a good policy that we should have a fine with it. Again, it's a small amount of money, but I think we need to establish that this is not something that we're serious about this, and we have to back up these regulations with some type of action. So I would make a motion to amend the motion as presented to add a $500 fine to Mergenthaler. Nothing against Mergenthaler at all, but as you say, they should have known, and I think in this case, I think that's very appropriate. And as we've seen from Mesa, they don't have a problem with that. So, Mr. Chairman?
I'll just take that as a friendly amendment if it's okay with a second.
You.
That's fine with me, but question, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman Lake.
Justin, is the sale of the Mergenthaler their entire company or just the Flathead area?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Lake, it is the entire statewide business, both regulated and non-regulated. Of course, we don't have jurisdiction over the out-of-state or non-regulated operations. They have set up the company going forward. That's one thing they attempted to work with staff on, is to kind of break it into 3 different operating areas: Kalispell, Bozeman, I believe, and Helena.
Now then, Mr. Chairman, is the headquarters for Mesa, are they going to be a Montana corporation, or is this coming from another state?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Lake, Mesa Systems is from Colorado, Grand Junction, Colorado. Our understanding is they do operate in a variety of states in the western U.S.
Because I think I remember that from a previous conversation. So, and I'm okay. I agree with the motion, and I do agree with the minor penalty. And basically, it's one of those, the fact that you tried to, or not necessarily tried to circumvent us, but they just didn't do it when they should have known better. I think 500 is probably a adequate number.
Mm-hmm.
Further discussion of the motion. Commissioner Koopman.
I'm not convinced this is the right way to go. I'm not convinced it isn't either. I'm kind of on the fence on this. I've taught taught my 4 kids when they were quite small that you play by the rules. You play by the rules, and that's something that as adults and as you grow up and run businesses and become responsible adults, and you continue to. You may not agree with the rules. Maybe an argument can be made that the policy where we need to approve these kinds of sales needs to change. I'm as you're not surprised to know, I believe in as light a touch of government on enterprise and the marketplace as possible. But we're dealing with specific rules here that need to be respected and honored. And if you want to try to change them, fine. There's a process for that. It isn't an option to ignore them. And I'm not trying to imply here that these are bad companies or bad people. Quite the opposite. I'm sure they're fine people, and whether it was just sloppy, or whether they felt their process was just sort of sloppy and they overlooked or at least didn't take real seriously our requirements of approval, or whether it was a very specific decision in order to avoid any exiting of good employees, and I can understand that concern. The fact is, the law is the law, the rules are the rules, and it just seems like we have been, over the years that I've been on this commission, in this position repeatedly of slapping the hands of those who are not respecting us. That doesn't work with kids, and it doesn't work with companies and regulated companies either. I don't believe. So I agree that there should be a fine also levied on assessed on Mergenthaler. I would prefer that the fine be more significant than $500 on each of them, and not to. Not with the idea of wanting to penalize them specifically so much as to say out there to the world that we regulate, we take our regulations seriously. And, it's one thing to say, yeah, you've communicated with staff and gosh, we're sorry and all that. And I'm sure that's all true. But what is the message we need to send to the next one that comes before us and says, gosh, I'm sorry, we should have done it differently, I apologize. I don't think this is working. I don't want to draw this out. I am inclined to say, though, that a oral argument session, a short one, just nothing that would be an extended process, but just to have them in front of us, to look us in the eye and explain what really happened here, so that there is a message out there that the Public Service Commission stands by its rules, and you play by the rules. So I'm going to vote against this motion. It's not a bad motion. I don't have strong opinions on this, but on balance, I would say this is one of those times when we need to just sort of stop the process long enough to bring them in and have a little discussion. Mr. Chairman.
Very briefly, Commissioner, hold down on your
Yes.
second bite at the apple.
Well, and this is the point. I talked about the fine, but also the reason why this, as Commissioner Koopman suggests, this is a very serious matter, is because we have this authority to come to a determination of the fitness of the transfer. And certainly we've dealt with fitness before of somebody moving into an area or granting a license to them. And it was not a concern to me, and I guess also to staff, because Mesa is a known entity working in Montana, but nevertheless, we do need to preserve, it's very important that we have that opportunity to pass upon the fitness of and capability of somebody taking over another license in that way. So I think it's very important that we send this message, Mr. Chairman.
It is, I think, truism in government that one-size solutions fit all never do. I would suggest that there are matters of degree with this kind of failure to comply with appropriate procedure. I would point out that not terribly long ago, we had a water utility that transferred assets without complying with procedures that were in place, and I believe the fine to that entity was in excess of $1 million. Wasn't it?
I believe it was in the hundreds of thousands.
All right,
150,000 maybe.
150,000 at any rate. Was significant. The actions on the part of that party were egregious and with malice aforethought. I am not convinced that's the case we have here. And I guess I think that levying the fine and backing that up with some pretty strident language from the legal department would be an adequate remedy in this case. So with that,
Chairman,
we
can I have a
will.
clarification?
Vice Chairman Lake, pardon me?
Just a clarification, the motion, I think, originally was $500 that was going to be applied to Mesa, and then when
No, Mergenthaler.
he was talking about, moving it over. That's right, Mergenthaler, but he was talking about each. Is the motion for $500 each?
No, the friendly amendment was simply to fine Mergenthaler on their way out the door $500.
We need more discussion on that because it may not. Personally, I think a 500 to Mesa, which they've already agreed to, is not out of order either.
Is that move to amend, Mr. Vice Chairman?
Friendly amendment. That's a friendly amendment. Be $500 each, because they're both parties were working on it, and I know Mesa was trying to move it.
Commissioner Pinocci, is that all right with you if we deem that to just accept them? All right, then, via friendly amendment, the motion is to approve the transfer and sale, to fine both parties $500, and to write an order in a way that makes abundantly clear our dissatisfaction with the manner in which this proceeding has moved forward. Mm-hmm. With no further discussion, then we'll call the question on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. No. Motion carries 4-1 with Commissioner Koopman dissenting. With no further business to come before this commission, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.